Hi, welcome. Welcome, Baby Bell, welcome. Gonna do read a little bit today. Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Gonna give it another few minutes for more people to show up. But yeah, I'm excited to do this. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm gonna be reading The Legend of Sleepy Hollow on this stream. And it is in the public domain, so Disney, you can't freaking sue me, okay? Welcome, welcome. I see a bunch of you are coming in. Welcome. Going to be reading The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in about a minute or so. This is actually my first time reading it. Going to be reading it here live for all of you. So it's going to be an interesting experience. Okay, I think I'm going to get started. All right, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of one of the most spacious covens, of which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at the broad expansion of the river dominated by the ancient Dutch navigators of the Tappan Zee, and where they always predominantly shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas, where they crossed. There lies a small market town or rural port, which some is called Greenberg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country from the intervening propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather a lap of land, among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook, which is one of the quietest places in the whole, a small brook which glides through it, with just a murmur enough to lull one to repose. The occasional whistle of a quail or a tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks it upon the uniform tranquility. Ooh, isn't that nice? I recollect that which I recollect that when stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a groove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all the nature is precisely quiet. and was startled by the roar of my own gun when it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for retreat, whither I must steal from the world and its descent and its distractions, and dream quietly of the remnant of a troubled life, I know none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and particular character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or the wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continental ravine. They are given all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abodes with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in other parts of the country. The nightmare in which the whole ninefold seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambles. Ooh, the power of reading, am I right? The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander in chief of all powers of air in the apparition of a figure of a horseback without a head. It is said by some that the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle in the Revolutionary War, and who had never anew seen by country folk, hurrying along in a gloom of night, as night of wings in the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extended at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vcinity of a church at no distance. Indeed, certain of these most authentic historians of these parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning this specter, algae, that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of the battle in a nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing at his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Ooh. Such in general purpose of the legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wind story in the region of the shadows. And the specter is known at all in the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the vision prophecy I have mentioned is not confirmed to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously embedded into everyone who resides there at a time. However, wide awake they must have been before they entered that sleepy region. They are sure in a little time to inhale the witching influence of air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. Ooh. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible loud, for it is such little retired Dutch valleys found here and that and they're embosomed in the great state of New York. That population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw in bubbling riding quickly at anchor or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find those same trees at the same families vegetating in the sheltered bosom. In the byplace of nature there adored, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy weight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the Victory. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest, and sets forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and country sold schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out from his sleeves, front that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame was most loosely being hung together. His head was small, a flat at the top, with large ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindling neck, to tell which way the wind had blown. To see him strangling along the profile of a hill on a windy day with his clothes bagged and fluttering around him, one might be mistaken him for the genius of famine this, uh, descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloping from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building, one of the large room, rudely constructed of logs, with the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was mostly um, ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a withe twisted in the handle of the door and stakes against the window shutters, so that through a thief might get through the perfect case, he would find some embarrassment in getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by an architect, Jost von Haust, from Mystery of an Eel Pot. The schoolhouse stood rather lonely but pleasant situation. Just a foot of a woody hill, with the brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices. Cunning, over the lessons. Might it be hard in drowsy summer's day, like hum of a beehive, interpreted now and then by the authoritative voices of the master in a tone of menace or command or um, purative by appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscious man, and never bore mind to the golden maxim. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Egypt Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. And I just want to clarify something here. I am reading this for the first time exactly as written. So if I mess up, that's why. And content wise, some of the language is a little bit different since the story is over 100 years old. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny spiraling that winched at the least flourish of the rod was passed by indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by infiscating a double portion on some little tough, wrong-headed, broad-skirted Dutch urchin who sulked and welched and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by the parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following by the assistants, so consolatory to the smartening urchin that he would remember it and thank him for it in the longest day he had to live. When the school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys. On holy afternoons, he would convey some of the smaller ones home who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers, noted that the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small and would have scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread. For he was a huge feeder, and through length had dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to the country custom in those parts, board and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he had instructed. With those he lived successfully a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be too onerous on the purse of his rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden, and schoolmates as mere drones. He had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in lighter labors on their farms, helping them make hay, mended the fence, took the horses to water, drove the cows to pasture, and cut wood in the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dormant dignity and absolute sway of with which he lorded in his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentile and ingratiated. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the younger, and, like the lion bold, which Wildam so magnificently the lamb did hold, he would sit with the child, one knee, and rock and cradle his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singer master of the neighborhood and picked up many bride shillings and instructing the young folks in solemnly. It was a matter of little no vanity to him on Sundays to take his situation as station in front of the church gallery, which a brand of chosen singers, where in his mind he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain to this, his voice resonated far above the rest of the congregation, and there were peculiar quivers still to be heard in the church, and which even be heard half a mile off, quite the opposite side of the mill pond, on a still Sunday morning, which they're said to be a legendary descended of the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by drivers' little makeshifts, that ingenious way in which commonly designated by Hook and by Crane, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was throughout. By all who understood nothing of labor or of hard work, to have wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster, generally a man of some importance in the female circle of the rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idol, gentleman-like personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the person. His appearance, therefore, is apt to the occasion some little stir at the tea table of the farmhouse, and the addition of the supernumerary dish of cakes or sweetness, or peradventure the parade of silver teapots. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure along them in the churchyard between services on Sunday, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overrun the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on tombstones, or soldering, which their amusement all epitaph, which with a whole heavy of them, along with banks and the adjacent mill pond, where the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. From his half itinerant life, also, he was kind of a traveling gazelle, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the woman as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's history of New England witchcraft, which, by the way, mostly firmed and potentially believed, which he mostly firmed and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No take was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the riverbed closer riverbed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's dreadful tales until the gathering dusk of the evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill, and there's a footnote here. The whippoorwill is a bird in which only heard at night. It receives its name from its note, which is taught to resemble these words. Interesting. From the hillside, the bonding cry of the tree toad, the harbinger of storm, the dreary hooting of the screeching owl, or the sudden rustling of the thicket birds, frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path. And if, by chance, a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging through his bludgeoning flight against him, the poor varlet was ready to give up the ghost, with the idea that he was struck with a witch's token. He only His only resource on such occasions, either to drown through the drive away from the spirals, was to sing psalm tunes. And he and the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasally melody. In linked sweetness long drawn out, floating down a distant hill or along a dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting, and spluttering along the hearth, and listening to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly particularly of the headless horseman or galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his audacious of anecdotes of witchcraft and of the direful omens, portentous sights, and sounds of air which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut. And he would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn round, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there was a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling the chimney corner of a chamber that was all ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dared to show his face. It was dearly punctured by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset, beset his path amidst the dim and gnarly glare of a snowy night? With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window? How other how often he would appalled how often he was appalled by some shrub covered in snow, which, like sheeted spectre, beset his very path. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder lest he should behold some uncouth being trampling close behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast, howling amongst the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. At these, however, there were mere terrors at night, phantoms of the mind that he would walk in darkness, and throughout he had many specters in his time, and been more than once beset by Satan in divers shapes in his lonely presumption, perambulations. Yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it. In despite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossing and being crossed more perpetually to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together. And that was a woman. I swear, this is my first time reading this. First time reading this. And pretty ironic for that passage in particular, especially if you saw my last video. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in solemnity was Katrina von Tassel, the daughter and the only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was blooming loss of fresh 18, plump as partridge, ripe and melting, and rosy cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely by her beauty, but by her vast expectations. She was she was withal a little of coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set her off charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great great grandmother had brought over from Sardon, the tempting stomacher of the old time, and withal a provoking short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. I'm sorry, first time reading this. And literally, I was not expecting them to get turned on by like an ankle. Was not expecting that. Ichibod Crane was soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Voluptuous Van Tussle was the perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was a snug, happy, and well conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and picked himself upon the hearty abundance rather than the style of which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of softness and sweetest water in a little well formed in the barrel. And Nan stole sparkling away through the grass of the neighboring brook that bubbled along among the alders and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served for a church, even every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with tremendous farm. The flail was bustly, resounding with it from morning to night. Swallows and martins skimmed twinkling about the eaves, and row of pigeons, some of some of one eye turned up, as if watching the weather, some of their heads under their wings and buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing their dames, were enjoying the sunshine of the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in response to the abundance of their pads, where hence sailed forth now and then troops of suckling pigs, as if to snuff the air. A stationary squadron of snowy geese were riding in the adjoining pond, convening whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard, and guinea fowls strutted about it like ill-tempered housewives, with their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door strutted the gallant cock, the pattern of a husband, a warrior, and a fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowing in the pride and glams of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, then generously calling his ever hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel of which he had discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon the sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about, which, with a puddling in his belly and an apple in his mouth, the pigeons were snugly put in their bed, comfortable in a comfortable pie, and tucked with coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing causingly in dishes, like snug married couples, with a decent compet- competency of onion sauce. In the porkers, he saw carved out future sleek side of bacon and juicy relish ham, not a turkey that he behind drainly tussed up, with its gizzard under its wing, and paired them a necklace of savory sausages, and every bright Chancellor himself lay sprawling over his back in his side dish, with uplifting claws as if with a quarter of his chivalrous spirits, despondent to ask while living. Wow, fascinating. At the entrapped Inchland at the entraptured Ichbod fancied all this. And as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat, and Indian corn, and all orchards burdened with ruddy fruit, which summoned the water tenement of Van Tassel. His heart yearned after the damsel who was inherit to these domains, and his imagination expanded, with which the idea of how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children mounted on top of a wagon, loading with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath, and he behind himself bestradded a pacing mare, with the colt of her heels, settling out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high ridged but lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers. The low projecting eaves formatting a Pisa along the front capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this hung flails, harnesses, and various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Benches were built along the sides for summer use, and great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza, the wondering Ichbod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion and the place of the usual residence. Here rows of resplendent pewter, ranging from on a long dresser, dazzling his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, readily spun, and another quantity of linsey wooden, just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn, strings of dried apples and peaches, hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the god of red peppers, and the door left ajar to give him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors andriums with their accompanying shovel and tongs, and glistening from covet of asparagus tops, mock oranges, and Cornish shells decorated the mantelpiece, Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A gray ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well mended china. From the moment each bard laid his eyes upon the regions of the delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tessel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight earnest of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dungeons, and such like easily conquered adventure uh, adversaries to contend with, and had to make his way merely through gates of iron and brass and walls of adornment in Castle Keep, where the lady of his heart was confined. The lady of his heart was confined, all of which he achieved as easily as the man would carve his way through the center of a Christmas pie. And then the lady gave her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of the country coquette, beset with the labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting the new difficulties and impediments. And he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood. The numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to their heart, keeping a watchful eye and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out of the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaming, residing blade of the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom, Van Brunst, who, the hero of the country round, which rang his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad shouldered and double jointed, with a short, curly black hair and fluff and, and bluff, but not unpleasant counter essence, having a mangled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for having great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on a horse as a Tartar. He was foremost at races. He was the foremost at races, all the races and cockfights, and with the ascendancy of which bodily strength acquires in rustic life, was umpire to all disputes, settling his hat on one side and giving his descendants with an air and tone admitting of no gainlay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or frostle, but he had more mischief than ill will in his composition. And with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at the bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded them as their model, and at the head of whom he scored the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles around. In cold weather, he was distinguished by a fur cap surrounded with flaunting foxtail. And when the folks at the country gathering described this well-known crest at a distance, whisking among the squad of hard riders, there were always stood by the squaw. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along the past farmhouses at midnight with whoop and halloo, like a troop of Don Cossacks. And the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for any moment till Hurry Scurry had cluttered by and exclaimed, "Aye, there go Broom Bones and his gang." The, that was a terrible impression. The neighbors looked up with him a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill. And when the madcap prank of Russell Browl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warned Brom Bones that it was the bottom of it. This rentable hero had for some time signaled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth galleries, and through his amorous toyish were something like the gentle caress and endearments of a bear. Yet it also whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his adventures were signals for rival candidates to retire who felt no inclination to cross the line of his armors. Insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's hailing on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or it was termed sparkling within, all the other suitors passed by in despair, carried out war into the other quarters. Such was a formidable rival with whom each Bob Crane had to counter and considered all things. A stouter man when he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despair. He had, however, a happy mixture of playability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form spirit, like a supple jack, yielding in yielding in his nature. He was in form, in spirit, like a supple jack, yielding but although throughout he bent, he never broke, and through he bowed beneath the slightest pressure. Yet the moment it was away, jerk, he was as erect and carried his head as high as ever. Erect isn't standing up. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be throttled with his armors. And more than that, stormy lover, um, Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insubduing manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of the partners, which was so often stumbled block in the path of lovers. Bald Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better than his pipe. And of course, he would love his daughter more than his pipe. That's what a decent father is. Like a reasonable man and excellent father, let her have her way in everything. uh, it can be interesting at parts, but other times it's like, what are we doing here? Like with these, like of course he loved his daughter more than his pipe. That's the most reasonable thing in the world. Like it would have been more reasonable to just spell out that he didn't. But sorry for rambling. I'll get back to the story. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend her own housekeeping and manage her poultry. For as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things that must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the dusty dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Balt would sit smoking his evening pipe at, at the other, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior who, armed with the sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting in the wind on the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by his side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wood. What? God, I have to read that again. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. Yeah, I messed up. Wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. They're people. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, while others have thousands of adventures and may be captured in thousand different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but still greater proof of generationship to maintain possession of the latter. For the man must battle his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he keeps undispositioned by the way over his heart. The redoubled brawn bones from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances. The interests of former evidently disabled. His horse was no longer seen tied at the paltings along Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Broom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, whom Fane had carried matters of open warfare, had settled their pretentious way to the lady according to the mode of which most concise and simple reasons. The knight errant of yore, by single combat, but Echeb was too conscientious of superior might of adversary to enter the lines against him. He overheard the boast of Bones, then doubled the schoolmaker up and lay him shelf in his double the schoolmaker up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse. Hold on a second. There was something extraordinarily provoking about this Obsidian Pacific system. It left Broom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rusted waggery and his disposition at the end of the brush practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They hurried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out by his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night, in spite of its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaker began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all the opportunities of turning him into a ridicule in presence of his mistress. Had scoundrel dog, whom he had taught to whine the most ludicrous manner, and introduced a rival to each of us. To instruct her in solemnity. Okay, I just read a lot, um, and I know it's been a short stream, but I'm thinking of ending it here for tonight, just because talking this much, I've been talking for over an hour with very little pause there. So I'm going to call it here for tonight. I'll have to do a part 2. I really appreciate you all being here, and it's a beautiful day because you're here. See you next time. Bye.